Hello, and welcome to Mind Sherlock, where every story feels like a conversation over a warm cup of coffee. Today, I bring you a brand new Sherlock Holmes mystery, filled with twists, clues, and clever deductions. Make yourself comfortable, and let's unravel the case together. And if you'd like, leave a quick comment and tell me where you're joining from. It's always a pleasure to know where our little detective community is tuning in from. Now, let's get started. It is no small matter for me to admit that there was once a case, a single, extraordinary case, that stands apart from all the others I chronicled in my long companionship with Sherlock Holmes. Of the many crimes we untangled, and of the countless webs of deception my friend unravelled with his singular mind, this particular affair has rested uncomfortably in my memory, not for its peculiar villainy, nor for the complexity of its clues, but because it was the only time I ever saw Holmes concede defeat. Even now, as I sit beside my fire, my pen hesitates before committing these events to paper, for they strike at the very heart of what I believed Holmes to be, an infallible machine of reason, immune to the whims of emotion or error. Yet, it was not logic that failed him, nor a sharper intellect that bested him. It was something altogether stranger, something I scarcely understand myself, though I was present for every step of the affair. It was the matter of Mr. Archibald Crane and the haunting message that followed his disappearance, that left even Sherlock Holmes without a ready answer. The afternoon on which this strange business first came to us was one of those bleak and miserable days for which London is so often remembered. A heavy rain had set in before noon, and the cobbles of Baker Street glistened beneath the dim light that filtered through the fogged windows of our sitting room. Holmes had spent much of the morning in one of his more pensive moods, stretched upon the sofa, with his long fingers steepled beneath his chin, and his gaze fixed upon some invisible point just above the mantelpiece. "You were at the tobacconist on Oxford Street this morning," he remarked suddenly, without turning his head. "Indeed I was," I replied, only slightly surprised by this customary demonstration of his observational powers. "And you stopped to examine that curious display of Turkish pipes near the door, though you bought nothing?" I chuckled, shaking my head. "It is moments like this, Holmes, that convince me you keep some infernal spirit under your employ to follow my every movement." "Not at all," said he. "Your right cuff is flecked with ash from the pipe you lifted to inspect, and your left boot bears a trace of the white cement dust used on the floor of that particular shop." It was a comfortable and ordinary scene, the sort that lulled me into the belief that the world outside was similarly ordinary. That belief was shattered within moments. Our comfortable stillness was broken by the sudden, frantic rap of knuckles against the door, followed almost immediately by Mrs. Hudson's announcement of a visitor, one whose appearance in our sitting room might have drawn a frown from even the most generous host. The man who stumbled inside was soaked through, his coat clinging to him like a second skin, and his boots leaving a small lake upon our rug. His hands trembled as they clutched his hat before him, wringing it between fingers pale with cold and agitation. His spectacles sat askew upon his nose, and his sandy hair hung in damp curls across his brow. "Mr. Holmes," he began, his voice cracking, "my name is Felix Hargrove. I am at my wit's end." Holmes gestured him toward the chair opposite, eyeing him with that cool and calculating stare that seemed to strip a man to his bones within moments. "You are a schoolmaster," he said calmly, "recently arrived from the country. I observed the chalk dust upon your sleeve, the ink stain upon your cuff, and the particular pattern of wear upon your boots, which speak of gravel paths rather than cobbled streets. But I confess, your distress is not of a pedagogical nature." Hargrove's eyes widened, though his astonishment gave way almost immediately to his more pressing anxiety. "It is my friend, Mr. Holmes, my closest friend, Archibald Crane. He has disappeared, and I fear for his very life." We urged the man to compose himself, and once his breath was steadied, his tale emerged in fits and starts, A tale so peculiar and unsettling that even Holmes, for all his outward nonchalance, could not entirely conceal his interest. Archibald Crane, it seemed, had been a man of modest habits and irreproachable character, a fellow schoolmaster whose most scandalous indulgence was an affinity for rare botanical specimens. Yet, 2 nights prior, Crane had received a letter delivered by an unknown hand, a letter that chilled Hargrove to recount. It bore no address, he explained, only his name upon the envelope. Inside, there was but a single sheet, upon which were scrawled these words: "Leave London within 24 hours or face the consequence." "Unsigned?" asked Holmes. "Entirely. There was no seal, no indication of its sender." "And what did your friend do upon receiving this curious missive?" He laughed at first. We both did. It seemed absurd, some student prank perhaps. But the next morning Crane was gone. His rooms were undisturbed, his bed unslept in. Only his walking stick and pocket watch were missing. Holmes leaned back, fingers once more steepled beneath his chin. "And has Mr. Crane any enemies? Any entanglements that might explain such a threat?" Hargrove hesitated, glancing at me before answering. "There were rumours," he said quietly, "of some youthful indiscretion, something tied to politics, though Crane never spoke of it openly. But they were old whispers, things no one took seriously." At this, Holmes smiled faintly, though it was a smile devoid of warmth. "Fear not, Mr. Hargrove. I dare say your friend is halfway to Paris by now, fleeing some creditor or entanglement of the heart. I shall be happy to confirm as much for you." There was a finality in Holmes's tone that troubled me, a rare dismissal that seemed too swift, too assured. As Hargrove departed into the rain once more, I turned to my friend. "You are quite certain of your conclusion?" Holmes waved his hand dismissively. "It is a hoax, Watson, plain as daylight. You will see." But even as he said it, a shadow seemed to pass across his face, like a man unconsciously doubting his own reflection. As Holmes leaned back with that air of detached amusement he often wore when a case seemed beneath his attention, Hargrove hesitated, his eyes darting between us, as though unsure whether to proceed. "There were rumours," he said at last. "Nothing ever proven, mind you, but whispers that Crane, in his youth, had fallen in with dangerous men, radicals who spoke of overthrowing the government." Holmes raised a brow. "Revolutionaries?" "Of a sort, though no arrests were ever made. Whatever occurred, it was long ago, and Crane put it all behind him. He built a life of quiet respectability and never spoke of it again." "Curious," Holmes murmured. "And do you believe this letter is tied to those ancient indiscretions?" Hargrove shook his head vigorously. "I cannot see how. It was all so long ago. Who would remember now?" I observed Holmes closely during this exchange, and though he appeared indifferent, there was a brief flicker in his eyes, like the shadow of a thought swiftly discarded. "Very well, Mr. Hargrove," said Holmes at length. "We shall investigate. But I assure you, your friend has more to fear from his own imagination than from any ancient spectre." When our visitor had gone, leaving a puddle upon the floor and a trail of uncertainty in his wake, Holmes reached for his pipe with the air of a man who had already solved the affair before rising from his chair. "Watson," said he, "I will wager my violin against your medical bag that this is nothing more than a schoolmaster's flight of fancy. A man with some old stain upon his character receives a prank letter, and in his excitement, he vanishes for a night or two, no doubt in the company of some discreet lady friend, or fleeing some minor debt." "I confess," I replied, "it seems a slender case upon which to hang such certainty." He smiled in that languid way of his, the smile that had so often preceded the unveiling of some astonishing chain of deductions. "My dear fellow, a man does not disappear so conveniently unless he wishes to be found inconveniently. This is not the work of a master criminal, but of a nervous amateur." I wanted to believe him, for his confidence was usually so well-founded, but something in Hargrove's tremulous voice lingered with me, a sense that we had glimpsed only the edge of a far darker picture. As Holmes resumed his place upon the sofa, exhaling a thin stream of smoke toward the ceiling, I felt the familiar tug of unease that came only when my friend displayed too much certainty too soon. There was a finality in his dismissal that struck me as out of character, a reluctance to entertain the possibility of deeper intrigue. I said nothing, for to question Holmes in such a mood was futile. But as I watched the rain continue its ceaseless drumming against the window pane, I could not shake the feeling that we were stepping into something far more sinister than either of us could yet see. The following morning found Holmes and me en route to the modest lodgings where Archibald Crane had resided for the past 3 years. Holmes, leaning back in the hansom, with his eyes half closed, offered no conversation, and I knew better than to interrupt him when his mind was thus engaged. It was not until we reached the narrow street in Bloomsbury that he roused himself, adjusting his gloves with the air of a man already certain of his conclusions. The landlady, a stout and anxious woman, admitted us at once, her relief at our arrival palpable. "I do hope you'll find him, gentlemen," she said, wringing her hands. Such a quiet tenant, never any trouble, and then to vanish like this. Holmes proceeded directly to Crane's room, his sharp gaze sweeping over every surface before the door had fully closed behind us. It was a tidy, orderly chamber, the kind belonging to a man of methodical habits. His books remained shelved, his writing desk undisturbed. Even his coat hung upon its peg, the pockets emptied with care, rather than the haste of flight. Only one object drew Holmes's particular attention, a small pocket watch lying open upon the bedside table, its hands frozen at precisely 2:17. Holmes held it to his ear, then glanced at me. "Stopped clean," said he. "The mainspring is intact. A deliberate act." He replaced it without further comment, but I saw the flicker of interest in his eyes. The watch was not merely overlooked by the fleeing man. It had been left as a message, though to whom, or for what purpose, remained to be seen. It was as we were preparing to leave that the landlady, who had hovered nervously at the door, cleared her throat. "There's something else, sir," she said. "I thought it might be nothing, but now, well, you ought to know." At Holmes's urging, she explained that, at approximately 5 o'clock that morning, she had seen a figure standing motionless across the street, facing the house. "A tall man, sir, all wrapped up in a heavy cloak and hat pulled down low. He stood there for near an hour, never moving, until the milkman's cart came rattling through, and then he was gone." Holmes pressed her for further details, but her recollection was frustratingly sparse. The cloak had been dark, the figure's face completely hidden. "It might have been a man," she said, "or a woman, for all I could tell, but it gave me such a shiver, seeing him, or her, just standing there like that." Holmes made no reply, but the faint curve of his lip indicated some private amusement. As we stepped into the street, he said to me, "A melodramatic touch, Watson. Cloaked watchers in the mist. Our Mr. Crane has a taste for theatrics." Yet there was something in his voice, some slight hesitation, that suggested Holmes himself was not entirely convinced. Holmes walked briskly ahead, his hands clasped behind his back, his head bowed in thought. "It is clear enough, Watson," said he. "We are dealing with a man who has staged his own disappearance to avoid some unpleasant consequence. Whether a debt collector, a jealous husband, or a professional disgrace, the pattern is unmistakable." "But the letter, the warning," I began. "A convenient prop," Holmes interrupted. "It is the oldest device in the world. What better way to throw one's pursuers off the scent than to feign pursuit by some imaginary villain? This letter, the staged departure, the watch left conspicuously behind. It is all the work of a man accustomed to reading sensational fiction, but lacking the refinement to craft a truly plausible deception." His confidence was as assured as ever, and yet I could not entirely share his certainty. There was something about the broken pocket watch, something so deliberate that struck me as out of place in a common flight from scandal. Yet Holmes, once settled into a theory, was not easily moved. "We shall speak with his colleagues at the school," said he. They will confirm, I have no doubt, that Crane was a man of irregular attachments and private follies, hidden beneath a mask of scholarly reserve. It is always so with these quiet types. The school in question lay a short distance away, a respectable institution where the corridors smelled faintly of chalk dust and oiled wood. Felix Hargrove was waiting for us, his nervous energy undiminished. He led us to the small common room where the teaching staff gathered between lessons, a modest affair, lined with bookshelves and cluttered with the remnants of morning tea. Here, Holmes conducted his inquiries with his customary precision, his questions cutting swiftly to the heart of the matter. The responses were, at first, unremarkable. Crane was well liked, though somewhat reserved. He had been dedicated to his pupils, punctual in his duties, and prone to spending long hours in solitary walks or poring over his botany collection. But as Holmes pressed further, a different portrait began to emerge. Crane, it seemed, had become increasingly anxious in recent months, prone to sudden silences and moments of distracted unease. One colleague recalled finding him late one evening, sitting alone in the darkened library, muttering to himself about old debts that cannot be paid. Most curious of all, they revealed that Crane had been an avid reader of Holmes's own published cases in the Strand. "He admired you greatly," said Hargrove. "He often spoke of your brilliance." Holmes gave no outward reaction, but I knew my friend well enough to recognize the tightening of his jaw, the flicker of irritation at becoming entangled in a case with such personal undertones. As we left the school, I ventured, "Surely his admiration for you would incline him to seek your help, rather than vanish entirely." Holmes waved the question aside. "Hero worship, Watson, a dangerous malady. It drives men to extremes they might otherwise avoid. Our friend Crane, I suspect, wished to craft a mystery worthy of my attention." His voice carried its usual confidence, but I could not help noticing how quickly he walked, as though eager to outrun his own doubts. It was as we were returning to Baker Street that a uniformed constable intercepted us, his boots slick with mud and his face flushed from exertion. "Begging your pardon, Mr. Holmes, but I was told you were asking after Mr. Archibald Crane," said he. "There's something you'll want to see." He led us to a secluded bend along the Thames, where the water lapped dark and sluggish against the embankment. There, partially caught beneath a broken wooden plank, lay a gentleman's hat. Battered, soaked through, and unmistakably marked with the initials AC upon the inner band. The constable's expression was grave. "We see this often enough," he said quietly. "Men who've lost everything, standing here a moment before they go in." Holmes, however, merely gave the hat a cursory glance. "A theatrical flourish, Watson," said he, brushing his hands together. "This hat was placed here deliberately, as a breadcrumb for anyone foolish enough to chase after it." "But surely," I began, "if Crane had wished to disappear quietly, he would not have left such an obvious clue." "Exactly so," said Holmes, "which is why this is the work of an amateur in deception. It confirms my suspicion that our missing schoolmaster is more concerned with fashioning drama than evading danger." He turned on his heel, leaving the constable blinking after him, and I followed, though with a growing sense that Holmes had resolved the matter too neatly for my liking. As we rode back to Baker Street, Holmes sat in silence, fingers tapping a restless rhythm upon the side of the cab. There was an air of finality in his bearing, as though he considered the affair nearly closed, save for the nuisance of tracking Crane to whatever boarding house or bolt hole he had chosen for his temporary exile. I, however, could not shake a gnawing disquiet. Holmes had always impressed upon me the value of doubt, of questioning every assumption, no matter how obvious. Yet here, he had dismissed the clues with unusual swiftness, brushing aside the letter, the watch, the cloaked figure, and now the hat, as though each were an inconvenience rather than a potential thread to unravel. It was not like him. The Holmes I knew relished ambiguity, thrived upon contradictions, and refused to settle for anything less than absolute certainty. I said nothing, for experience had taught me that to question Holmes prematurely would elicit only a dry remark or a cutting jest. Yet in my heart, I knew this case had unsettled him in some subtle way. Perhaps because the man at its centre had spent so many evenings reading Holmes's own exploits, fashioning himself into the sort of mystery he believed my friend would admire. And so I resolved to watch Holmes closely, knowing that even the keenest mind can sometimes be blinded by its own reflection. We had scarcely removed our coats when Mrs. Hudson appeared at the sitting-room door, a sealed envelope trembling in her hand. "Another one, Mr. Holmes," she said, her voice low. "It came by the afternoon post, with no return address." Holmes took the envelope with a smile of mild amusement, sinking into his chair as he slit the seal with his penknife. "Another chapter in our schoolmaster's melodrama, no doubt," he said. Yet as his eyes moved down the page, the smile faded, replaced by a frown of quiet concentration. "Curious," he murmured. "Very curious." He passed me the letter, which contained but a single line. The great Sherlock Holmes sees only what he expects to see, and so the obvious danger stands before him, invisible. There was no signature, no identifying mark, only that taunting sentence scrawled in a hand that trembled slightly, as though written in haste or agitation. "It is Crane himself, of course," said Holmes, leaning back with a yawn. "He has a flair for the dramatic. I will grant him that." But I saw the flicker of uncertainty in his face before he concealed it behind his habitual air of detachment. "You do not think," I began, "that this letter warrants further examination?" "Pure theatrics," said Holmes firmly. "The case, my dear Watson, is already solved in all essentials." I said nothing, but as I gazed upon that trembling scrawl, my own doubt deepened into something colder, something perilously close to fear. Holmes' mood the following morning was one I knew well, a curious blend of restlessness and languid indifference, such as possessed him when a case was not yet challenging enough to fully engage his faculties. It was in such a frame of mind that we set off toward the southern edge of the city, where the Thames gave way to older, narrower streets, and London thinned into something more ancient and forgotten. Felix Hargreaves had sent word of a curious account. Several townsfolk had seen Archibald Crane, or a man of his description, frequenting a crumbling chapel on the outskirts. It was said that, on more than one occasion, Crane had been observed slipping through the rotting gate near midnight, only to kneel alone at the altar in silent prayer for upwards of an hour. It was a strange image, one wholly at odds with the quiet, practical schoolmaster we had heard described. Holmes listened to Hargreaves' account with no comment, but I noted the quickening of his step as we approached the chapel, a sign, I knew, that something about this incongruous piety had piqued his interest. The chapel itself was a ruin of the older sort, a building whose stones had seen plague, rebellion, and the passage of centuries. Ivy crept over its walls, and the bell tower leaned at a perilous angle. It was a place that seemed to exist out of time, forgotten by all save those drawn to it by some private sorrow or secret guilt. "An odd sanctuary for a man like Crane," I ventured. "Quite," Holmes replied. "A rational man has no business with ghosts." He pushed open the creaking door, and together we stepped into the chill of the chapel's gloom. The air inside the chapel was cold, though whether from disuse or some quality inherent to the place itself, I could not say. Holmes moved forward at once, his gaze sweeping across the worn pews and the weathered altar, his every step measured and deliberate. It was he who noticed the mark first, a faint stain upon the back wall, half obscured by shadows and the passage of time. Drawing a match from his pocket, Holmes struck it and held the flame aloft. There, revealed in flickering light, was a crude but unmistakable image. A serpent devouring its own tail. "The Ouroboros," Holmes murmured. "An ancient symbol, older than London itself. But this particular form, do you observe, Watson? The sharpness of the inner line, the angular flourish at the head, these are the hallmarks of a particular group of anarchists who called themselves the Circle of Rebirth." I stared at him in astonishment. "Anarchists, Holmes?" "Of a peculiar sort," he replied. Not your common agitators, but men who believed that society must be entirely dissolved before any true order could rise. They fancied themselves philosophers, though they behaved more like fanatics. He tapped the wall thoughtfully. The circle dissolved nearly 20 years ago, after a rather public trial and a series of internal betrayals. I had thought them extinct. You believe Crane was involved with such a group? Holmes shrugged. There is no evidence as yet, but it is a curious place for a schoolmaster to take his prayers. I could not suppress a shiver. There was something deeply unsettling about the chapel, as though the very air still held the echo of whispered oaths and ancient grievances. Holmes, however, seemed wholly unaffected, his analytical mind impervious to atmosphere. Superstition, Watson, he said as if reading my thoughts. This is a relic of human folly, no more. He turned toward the door, but even as we left I could not help glancing back at the serpent on the wall. I had no logical reason to do so, but I felt certain that Archibald Crane had knelt beneath that symbol, not out of faith, but out of fear. Holmes had begun to turn toward the door when the sound of shuffling footsteps reached our ears. From the narrow corridor beyond the chapel's modest vestry, there emerged a man whose very appearance seemed to belong to the chapel, as much as the decaying wood and stone. He was tall, thin to the point of frailty, and his face, pale and hollow-eyed, bore the expression of a man long accustomed to sleepless nights and whispered fears. "I am the Reverend Tuttle," he said, his voice little more than a whisper. "You are here about Mr. Crane, are you not?" Holmes gave a slight nod, and the clergyman wrung his hands before continuing. "I knew he would bring someone," said Tuttle. "He told me as much, though I begged him not to return here. There are certain burdens which a man cannot cast aside, no matter how many years have passed." Holmes's expression betrayed neither curiosity nor surprise, but I could feel the weight of the silence that followed. "And what exactly did Mr. Crane fear?" Holmes asked at last. The clergyman swallowed hard before answering. "He spoke of a figure," Tuttle said, "a shadow that had followed him across the years. He called it the penitent. It was no name I knew, nor was it a man whose face he could describe, only a presence that seemed to move just beyond his sight, watching, waiting." Tuttle's hands trembled violently as he spoke, and I felt a distinct chill creep over me, though Holmes remained unmoved. "Crane believed this penitent was no ordinary man," the Reverend continued. "He believed it to be the living consequence of some past sin, returned to call him to account." "And did you see this figure yourself?" Holmes asked, his tone neutral. Tuttle shook his head. "I have seen only the man it haunted. That was enough." For a moment, none of us spoke. Holmes stood with his hands clasped behind his back, his eyes half-lidded in thought. "Thank you, Reverend," he said at length. "Your concern for your parishioner does you credit, but I assure you, we are dealing with no ghost." I wished I could share Holmes's certainty, but something in Tuttle's haunted face had settled into my mind, and no amount of reasoning could quite dislodge it. As we left the chapel and returned to the grey streets outside, Holmes lit a cigarette with a flick of his match and strode forward with the confident air of a man who had heard nothing to alter his view. "Surely, Holmes," I said, "you cannot entirely dismiss the fear in that man's voice. He believed what he said." "Of course he did," Holmes replied. "But that belief is of no consequence. The good Reverend has spent too many years surrounded by whispers of damnation and penance. It has addled his reason." "But what of Crane's fear?" I pressed. "Surely a rational man—" Holmes stopped abruptly and turned to me, his grey eyes glinting with something between amusement and irritation. "My dear Watson, you astonish me. You, a man of science, standing here arguing for phantoms and vengeful spirits. What next? Shall we consult a medium?" I flushed at his tone but refused to be dissuaded. "All I am saying is that fear, real or imagined, has driven Crane to some desperate act. To ignore that fear entirely is to ignore the motive behind his disappearance." Holmes took a long pull from his cigarette before replying. "Fear, Watson, is the most easily manufactured of all human emotions. It requires no ghostly figure, no supernatural penitent. A shadow in the fog, a threatening letter, the weight of a guilty conscience. Any of these will suffice. I could not argue with his logic, and yet my unease remained. There was something too theatrical, too deliberate in every clue we had uncovered, each one designed, it seemed, to present Holmes with precisely the sort of puzzle Crane would have read about in our published cases. It was a troubling thought, but Holmes had already turned the corner, and I hurried to follow him, leaving the chapel and its shadows behind us. The following day found Holmes in an altogether different humour, energetic, purposeful, and, to my surprise, wholly preoccupied with a new theory regarding Archibald Crane's disappearance. "I have been making inquiries, Watson," said he, rubbing his hands with satisfaction as we took our breakfast. "It appears our elusive schoolmaster may not have been quite the paragon of virtue his colleagues believed." Holmes produced a folded telegram from his breast pocket. "Observe, it seems that, not 3 months ago, Crane was seen in the company of a certain Mrs. Lydia Pemberton, the young wife of a rather distinguished barrister." I raised my eyebrows. "An affair?" "Not proven, but I shall call upon Mrs. Pemberton this morning, and I have no doubt she will shed light upon the matter." The visit was made without delay, but if Holmes had anticipated scandal, he was soon disappointed. Mrs. Pemberton, a plain and practical woman, informed us that she had indeed made Crane's acquaintance, but solely to consult him regarding her younger brother's education. "Mr. Crane was most helpful," she said, "but I have not seen him since." "And your husband?" asked Holmes. "He knows all about it," she replied calmly. "Indeed, he suggested I seek Mr. Crane's advice in the first place." As we left the Pemberton residence, Holmes was uncharacteristically silent. "A dead end," I ventured. "An irrelevance," he corrected. "But every irrelevance clears the field." Yet I could not help but notice that Holmes's stride had lost a measure of its customary certainty. For the remainder of the afternoon, Holmes occupied himself with his violin, the mournful strains filling our sitting room while I pored over my notes, searching for some pattern to link the chapel, the Ouroboros, and the nameless fear that had gripped Archibald Crane. At length, Holmes laid aside his instrument with an air of irritation. "Watson," said he sharply, "you are scribbling like a clerk preparing an inventory. Have you nothing more useful to contribute?" The outburst startled me. Holmes was rarely so curt without cause. "I am merely attempting to organize the facts," I replied. "There are more unknowns in this case than certainties." He exhaled sharply. "Precisely the trouble. The entire affair is amateurish, theatrical, and yet maddeningly resistant to logical resolution. It is a child's riddle dressed in a cloak of mystery." "You seem uncommonly affected by it," I observed. Holmes shot me a glance that was part irritation, part something else. "Affected," he repeated. "I am affected only by the sheer incompetence of our vanished schoolmaster's efforts at misdirection." But I knew Holmes too well. Beneath the brittle sarcasm, there was a trace of doubt, a rare crack in the armour of his intellect. Evening found us once more at the chapel, retracing our steps in the fading light. Holmes's mood had darkened with the sky, and there was a terseness to his speech I could not quite account for. As we passed through the chapel's doorway, Holmes paused, his gaze drifting toward the weathered altar and the serpent mark on the wall. "Superstition," he muttered, "a relic of primitive thought, unworthy of serious attention." Yet his voice lacked its usual confidence. I ventured to ask if he truly believed there was no force, human or otherwise, that could elude his reasoning. Holmes straightened at once, his chin lifting defiantly. "No ghost, no phantom, no shadow from the past could ever outwit me, Watson," said he. "The supernatural exists only in the minds of men too weak to confront reality." His words rang out in the silence, as though they demanded some unseen witness to contradict them. None did, and yet I felt a strange foreboding settle over me, as if the very air had thickened with unspoken warning. I said nothing further, but as we left the chapel, I found myself glancing back once more, half expecting to see some spectral figure watching from the gloom. If Holmes noticed my hesitation, he gave no sign. There are moments in our long association when Sherlock Holmes displayed a kind of theatrical audacity which, while occasionally alarming to me, rarely failed to produce the desired result. It was with such audacity that he embarked upon the next stage of our pursuit of Archibald Crane. "Concealment thrives upon silence, Watson," said he that afternoon. "We shall replace it with the loudest noise at our disposal." And so, with his usual brisk efficiency, Holmes drafted a notice for the Evening Standard, addressed directly to Crane, or to any soul who knew his fate. It was not a plea for information, nor a humble request for aid, but a bold and public declaration that Sherlock Holmes had taken up the case, and that the shadows encircling Archibald Crane were now under the scrutiny of his formidable intellect. "Why such provocation?" I asked, somewhat uneasy at the tone of the notice. "We are no longer chasing Crane," Holmes replied. "We are drawing out the hand that holds the strings. Whoever sent that first letter will find himself forced to respond, and by doing so shall reveal his very existence." It was a characteristic stroke of Holmesian logic, bold, confrontational, and contemptuous of half measures. I feared it might provoke precisely the kind of danger we were ill-prepared to face. Yet I knew from long experience that there was no dissuading Holmes when his mind was fixed upon a strategy. The notice appeared in the evening edition, and we returned to Baker Street to await the inevitable reply. Holmes seemed at ease, but I found myself glancing toward the window more often than usual, half expecting some shadowy figure to be watching from the gloom beyond. The reply came sooner than either of us anticipated. The clock on the mantel had just struck midnight when Mrs. Hudson, in her nightcap and shawl, tapped at our door with her customary mixture of urgency and disapproval. "There's someone at the front step," she whispered, "and I don't like the look of him." Holmes leapt to his feet, his eyes alight with the thrill of the hunt. "Show him in," he said. The visitor entered without a word, the very picture of Gothic mystery. Cloaked and hooded, his face obscured by the deep brim of his hat, the figure stood motionless for a moment before extending a gloved hand. In it was a single envelope, sealed in wax, which Holmes took without hesitation. "From Mr. Crane?" Holmes asked, but the figure gave no answer. With a slight bow, the messenger turned and vanished as swiftly as he had appeared. "Curious," Holmes muttered, breaking the seal. His expression altered almost immediately, a shift so subtle that only years of close acquaintance allowed me to detect it. "Well, Watson," said he, "it seems our quarry is very much alive, and for once it appears I am mistaken." He handed me the letter, and I recognized the hand at once. It was Crane's, shaky but unmistakable. The contents, however, were far more alarming than the trembling script in which they were written. "Mr. Holmes, you are wrong. I live, but I do not dare return. I have seen what follows me, and I would rather take my chances in exile than face what waits in London. There is a danger your methods cannot uncover, because it is not the kind of danger that leaves footprints or fingerprints. It lives in the shadow behind reason, where deduction cannot reach. Please, do not search for me. I beg you. There are forces even your great mind will not comprehend. Yours in terror, Archibald Crane." I read the letter twice, scarcely able to comprehend the fear which seemed to seep from every line. Holmes, however, merely folded the paper with his customary precision and set it beside the lamp. "Well?" I asked. "What do you make of it?" "A man in the grip of fear, Watson," said Holmes. "And fear, as I have told you before, is the enemy of reason." "But if Crane lives," I pressed, "then the warnings were not a fabrication after all." Holmes shrugged. "A man may both flee a real threat and indulge in melodrama at the same time. His letter tells me only that he is afraid. The cause of that fear remains to be uncovered." Yet his calmness was forced, I could see that. For all his logic, some part of Holmes, some small but growing doubt, had taken root, and even Sherlock Holmes could not entirely dismiss it. Holmes had scarcely set the letter aside when he sprang to his feet. "Watson, your coat," Quickly, Lestrade will meet us at the corner. I had long since learned that argument was futile in such moments, and within minutes we were hurrying through the fog-shrouded streets, with Holmes moving at a pace that tested even my military-hardened legs. Lestrade, summoned by a hasty note earlier in the day, fell in beside us without a word. "Our messenger cannot have gone far," Holmes said. "A figure of such conspicuous dress does not vanish without trace unless aided by the very environment into which he retreats." It was a chase of the most infuriating kind, through narrow alleys and along streets where the lamplight flickered uncertainly in the mist. Twice we caught sight of the cloaked figure, a fleeting glimpse at the end of a passage, or a swirl of cloak as a door swung shut. Yet each time we neared, the quarry slipped away, as though possessed of some uncanny foresight. "He knows these streets," muttered Lestrade. "I'd wager he's local." "Not local," Holmes said through clenched teeth. "Prepared." On we went, past shuttered shops and sleeping houses, until we reached a warren of alleys so narrow we were forced to proceed single file. At the alley's end, we emerged into an open square and found nothing. No figure, no footsteps, no sign that anyone had passed. Holmes stood motionless, his brow furrowed in profound irritation. "Vanished," said Lestrade. "Impossible," Holmes snapped, but the square remained silent, and even my own belief faltered. Holmes said nothing further as we made our way back to Baker Street, but I could see that his mind was working furiously, less at solving the puzzle than at how such a puzzle could exist at all. Once back in our sitting room, Holmes sank into his chair with uncharacteristic weariness, his fingers steepled before him, but without their usual precision. His gaze rested not on me, nor on any point of particular interest, but rather drifted aimlessly about the room, as though searching for an anchor amidst uncertainty. I had seen Holmes defeated before, rare moments when a case momentarily eluded him, but this was different. This was not frustration at the cleverness of an opponent. This was the inward torment of a man forced to consider, however briefly, that his method itself had limits. "Every fact fits, Watson," he muttered at last, "and yet the picture will not resolve." "Perhaps," I offered gently, "it is not the facts that are wrong, but the frame into which you are placing them." He glared at me for a moment, then gave a short, humorless laugh. "Are you suggesting I discard reason altogether? Shall we summon a medium to consult the spirits?" I had no answer, for I knew, as he did, that reason was his only weapon, and now it seemed blunted against something Holmes could neither see nor grasp. A sharp knock at the door spared us further debate. Reverend Tuttle stood upon our threshold, his hat in his trembling hands, his face drawn and bloodless. "I was summoned," he said faintly, "by a dying man." Holmes gestured him to a chair, and the clergyman sank into it heavily. "He was one of them," Tuttle said, "a member of the circle Mr. Crane once betrayed, long before he came to London. The man was dying, raving, and in his final moments he begged me to bring you this." From within his coat, the Reverend produced a folded paper, its edges stained and trembling with age. Holmes took it, his expression impassive, though I saw how tightly he gripped the page. "It explains why Mr. Crane fled," Tuttle whispered. "Why no place was safe for him." Holmes unfolded the paper, and for a moment the room held its breath. The paper was a confession of sorts, a document written by a man whose name meant nothing to me, but which seemed to strike some dim chord in Holmes's memory. It spoke of a brotherhood of the Ouroboros, a circle Crane had once infiltrated in his reckless youth, a group that had sworn by blood oath to pursue any traitor to the grave. "They were fanatics," Holmes murmured, "believers not only in revolution, but in a kind of eternal justice, a justice that followed the soul even beyond death. The brotherhood had disbanded long ago, torn apart by infighting and betrayal. Yet the vow endured. Those who had sworn it were bound to avenge the circle's destruction, even if it took decades." Crane's name, written in a different hand, appeared at the very bottom, marked for death with chilling finality. "Fear, Watson," said Holmes quietly. This time, it was not fabricated. Holmes turned the page and found a final line, scrawled across the margin in ink, so dark it seemed fresh. Even Sherlock Holmes cannot see what he does not believe. He read the line twice, his face devoid of expression. But I, who knew him so well, saw the rarest crack in the armor of his intellect. It was not the words themselves that struck him, but the fact that they anticipated his every step, his every dismissal, his very mode of thought. For the first time in all our cases, Holmes sat in silence, not in the silence of analysis, but of reluctant recognition. He laid the paper aside and stood, crossing to the hearth where the fire had burnt low. "Even the keenest eye," he said softly, "will miss what it refuses to see." And with that, Sherlock Holmes stood defeated, not by superior logic, but by the boundaries he had drawn around his own mind. It was 3 days later when the telegram arrived, addressed to Holmes but delivered into my hands as my friend stood, silent and withdrawn, at the window. I confess that my heart quickened as I read, for the message contained the first clear fact in a case clouded by shadows and misgivings. Archibald Crane located, found alive in Inverness, under name Matthew Croft. Stop, fled upon reading your public notice. Stop, fear's pursuit still upon him. I read it aloud, expecting Holmes to show some flash of triumph, some wry remark about the inevitable triumph of reason. Instead, he only nodded absently. "So," said he at length, "the man lives." It was a flat observation, void of satisfaction, and I could not help but sense that Holmes's mind had already moved beyond Crane himself to the broader implications of the affair. We learned soon after that Crane had sought refuge in a boarding house near the Inverness docks, presenting himself as a travelling botanist. It was only upon seeing his own name in the London papers, linked directly to Holmes, that he realised his ruse had failed. He confessed haltingly to the local constable, admitting his terror that the Brotherhood, though broken, might still have its watchers in the world. He had run not only from them, but from Holmes as well, for Crane feared that Holmes, too rational, would dismiss the very danger that had driven him into hiding. News of Crane's survival, and of the confession left by the dying man, spread quickly enough to those few remnants of the Brotherhood who still drew breath. Their leader, old, blind, and riddled with the consequences of past violence, was dead within the week, whether by natural cause or some pact fulfilled, none could say. With his passing, the Brotherhood dissolved entirely. Its members, once fanatics, were now only old men haunted by the ghosts of their own youth. Yet for all that, a shadow lingered in my mind, as I believe it lingered in Holmes. Not every story can be reduced to a comfortable moral, nor every fear to mere delusion. There are forces, I had come to understand, which operate not in defiance of reason, but just beyond its reach, forces not supernatural, but psychological, born from the terrible capacity of man to believe in his own doom. The Brotherhood was gone, but the mark they had left upon Archibald Crane, and perhaps upon Sherlock Holmes, would endure long after the case itself was closed. That evening, Holmes and I sat opposite one another, the case file resting between us like a settled wager. Holmes's expression, usually so sharp in the wake of a solved case, was strangely pensive. "I was wrong," he said abruptly. The admission startled me so thoroughly that I could think of no reply. Never before had I heard those words from Sherlock Holmes, not in jest, not in self-deprecation, and certainly not in earnest. "I was wrong," he repeated, "not in the facts, for every deduction regarding Crane's movements, his history, and even the so-called threats, proved correct. I was wrong in something far deeper, my refusal to account for the irrational." "Surely," I said, "you do not believe there was anything supernatural in the matter?" "Supernatural? No," said Holmes, "but man is not made of logic alone, Watson. Fear can become its own creature, independent, self-perpetuating. The human mind, once convinced of its own doom, will seek that doom even when no external hand moves against it. I dismiss the fear itself as irrelevant, and in doing so, I miss the true nature of the case. I saw now what disturbed Holmes so profoundly. It was not that he had failed to see the clues, but that he had failed to see the possibility that fear itself could be both cause and consequence. In all our years together, no case had ever left Holmes so quietly shaken. Not by defeat, he had, after all, uncovered the facts with his usual brilliance, but by the recognition that there were limits to the very method upon which his life's work depended. He had not been outwitted by superior cunning, nor misled by clever fabrication. Instead, Holmes had been ensnared by the rigidity of his own mind, a mind so attuned to logic that it could not, or would not, entertain the possibility that fear could be real, even if the threat itself was not. It was, for me, a sobering realization that even the greatest intellect, armed with the keenest powers of observation, could still stumble upon the most human of blind spots, the refusal to believe that what cannot be measured may yet exist. I closed my notes that night with an uncharacteristic heaviness, knowing that the case would never find its way to publication. Some stories, I had come to understand, are meant only for those who lived them. Holmes sat long into the night, his gaze fixed upon the fire, his hands steepled in his characteristic pose, but there was no sense of satisfaction in his expression, no trace of the triumph that usually accompanied a closed case. "Even the keenest mind stumbles," he said at last, "when it assumes the world obeys reason alone." There was no need for me to reply. I knew those words were not meant for me, but for Holmes himself. A private confession made aloud only because I was the one man permitted to hear it. Long after he retired, I remained by the fire, turning over each twist and revelation of the case in my mind. And though the rationalist in me accepted the facts as Holmes had laid them out, the man who had stood beside him in that chapel, who had seen the fear in Reverend Tuttle's eyes and heard the tremor in Crane's voice, could not help but wonder, what if there were things even now that lay just beyond the reach of reason? I do not know if Holmes wondered the same. If he did, he never spoke of it again. The fire had dwindled to its last embers when Holmes spoke again, his voice low and measured, as though addressing the flames rather than me. "Watson," said he, "the true danger of a rigid mind is not that it overlooks the facts, but that it decides before the facts present themselves which of them are worthy of belief." He turned, his sharp gaze catching mine. I believed that fear was irrelevant, that a rational mind could brush aside the irrational as though it were smoke before the wind. And yet, what is fear, if not a fact in its own right? It shapes actions, hides truths, and drives men to ruin. I could offer no answer, for I knew Holmes was not speaking for my benefit. This was a conversation he held with himself, a rare and humbling dialogue between the man and his own method. "It was not logic that failed me," he said at last. "It was imagination. Before we close the case, let me ask you this. What do you believe was the Brotherhood's greatest mistake? Was it trusting a traitor, or believing they could outwit Sherlock Holmes altogether? Your deductions, dear reader, are most welcome. If you enjoyed this rare glimpse into Sherlock Holmes' own fallibility, and the lesson even the greatest detective had to learn, be sure to subscribe for more untold mysteries from Baker Street. Share this story with fellow mystery lovers, and of course, leave your own theories in the comments below. The game, my friends, is always afoot.